They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned the hard way that greed is thicker than blood. My name is Franklin Carpenter, and 67 years on this earth have taught me that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones you'd die for. This is the story of how my own son tried to steal 43 years of my life's work right out from under me at our family Thanksgiving dinner, and how I made damn sure he regretted every second of it. But before I tell you how I got my revenge, I need you to understand something. If you've ever built something from nothing, if you've ever trusted family with your legacy, if you've ever felt that sick feeling in your gut when someone betrays you, then this story isn't just mine, it's yours too. And if you stick around to hear how this ends, I promise you'll want to share it with everyone you know. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the courts or the police. Sometimes it comes from an old man who's tired of being underestimated. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about family forever. The betrayal started on November 24th, 2022, Thanksgiving Day. I remember because it was the day my world cracked wide open and nothing was ever the same again. Picture this. I'm sitting at the head of my dining room table, the same mahogany table I'd bought 30 years earlier when Carpenter Sons Construction finally started turning a real profit. The turkey was golden, the cranberry sauce was homemade by my daughter-in-law Sarah, and my 3 grandchildren were arguing over who got the biggest piece of pumpkin pie. It should have been perfect. My wife Margaret had been gone for 2 years by then, cancer taking her just like it had taken her mother before her. But we still set a place for her, still said grace the way she would have wanted. The business was doing better than ever. We'd just landed the biggest contract in our company's history, a $12 million shopping complex that would keep us busy for the next 2 years. At 65, I was finally ready to start stepping back, to let my son Danny take over more of the day-to-day operations. Danny had been working with me for 22 years. Started when he was fresh out of college with a business degree, cocky as hell but willing to learn. I taught him everything: how to read blueprints, how to manage crews, how to deal with difficult clients, how to bid jobs so you make money but still win the contract. He was good at it too. Real good. Better than I ever expected him to be. But there were signs I should have seen earlier. Small things that didn't seem important at the time. The way he'd started taking meetings without me. How he'd gotten secretive about certain contracts. The fact that he'd been asking a lot of questions about the company's financial structure, about ownership percentages, about my retirement plans. I figured he was just being responsible, thinking ahead. God, I was naive. So there we were, all gathered around that table. Danny, his wife Sarah, their 3 kids, my grandchildren Emma, 12, Jake, 10, and little Lily, just 7. My daughter Rebecca had flown in from Denver with her husband Michael and their twin boys. It was chaos in the best way possible. Kids laughing, adults catching up, the smell of turkey and stuffing filling the house. I stood up to carve the turkey just like I had every year since Margaret passed. That's when Danny cleared his throat and said the words that would change everything. He didn't even wait for me to finish carving. Just stood up, straightened his tie like he was about to give a business presentation, and looked right at me with these cold eyes I'd never seen before. "Dad," he said, and his voice had this formal tone that made my blood run cold. "I need to tell everyone something important about the business." The room went quiet. Sarah looked confused. Rebecca stopped mid-sentence. Even the kids sensed something was wrong and stopped their chatter. "Sarah and I have been talking with some investors," Danny continued, and I felt my chest tighten. "We've decided it's time to sell Carpenter Sons Construction." I nearly dropped the carving knife. "What?" "The offer is incredible, Dad. $28 million. We can't pass this up." 28 million. That number hit me like a sledgehammer. In 43 years of building that company, I'd never imagined it could be worth that much. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. It was what he said next. "Of course, since you never formally transferred ownership to me, and since you're getting older, we think it's best if you just step aside and let us handle this transition. You'll be taken care of, don't worry. We're not heartless." The room was dead silent now. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear. Rebecca's mouth was hanging open. I could feel my hands shaking. "What exactly do you mean by taken care of?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Danny had the audacity to smile, actually smiled like he was doing me a favor. "Well, we were thinking a nice retirement home, somewhere with good care, where you won't have to worry about anything, and maybe a small monthly allowance so you can buy whatever you need." A retirement home. A monthly allowance. From the business I'd built with my own 2 hands, working 16-hour days for 4 decades, missing school plays and baseball games and family dinners because I was trying to build something that would last generations. That's when Sarah spoke up and I realized this wasn't just Danny's idea. "Franklin, you have to understand. You're 67 years old. The stress of running a company this size, it's not good for your health. We're worried about you. Worried about me. These people who saw me maybe twice a month unless there was a holiday or a birthday, and they were worried about me. And honestly," Danny continued, and his voice got harder now, more businesslike, "the investors have concerns about having someone your age involved in the day-to-day operations. It's a liability issue." Liability issue. My own son just called me a liability. I looked around that table at my family. Rebecca looked horrified, but she'd never been involved in the business. Her husband Michael was studying his plate like it was the most interesting thing in the world. The grandchildren were confused and scared. And Danny was looking at me like I was already dead. That's when I understood. This wasn't a conversation. This wasn't him asking for my opinion or my blessing. This was him telling me how it was going to be. He'd already made up his mind. Hell, he'd probably already signed papers. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked. "About 6 months," he said, not even having the decency to look ashamed. "The investors approached us back in May, but we wanted to wait until after the holidays to make it official." 6 months, while I'd been teaching him everything I knew about the Riverside Shopping Plaza project, while I'd been trusting him with client meetings and financial decisions, while I'd been proud of how well he was stepping up. He'd been planning to cut me out completely. "Dad," he said, and for a second his voice softened. "This is a good thing. You've worked your whole life. You deserve to relax, to enjoy your retirement. Let us take care of everything now." But I could see through the performance. This wasn't about me relaxing or enjoying retirement. This was about Danny getting rich quick and not wanting to share with his old man. I set down the carving knife very carefully. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Something cold and hard had settled in my chest. Something I hadn't felt since I was a young man fighting my way up in the construction business. "Get out," I said quietly. "Dad." I said, "Get out of my house." I looked at Sarah. "All of you. Get out." Sarah started crying. The kids were confused and scared. Rebecca tried to play peacemaker, saying we should all calm down and discuss this like adults. But Danny just stood there with this satisfied look on his face, like he'd expected this reaction and was pleased that I was proving his point about being too old and unstable to run a business. "Fine," he said. "We'll be in touch through our lawyer. Try not to make this harder than it has to be, Dad." "Our lawyer." He said our lawyer, like we were enemies now instead of father and son. They left. All of them. Even Rebecca and her family, though she kept looking back with this expression like she wanted to say something but didn't know what. The house went from full of laughter and family warmth to dead empty in about 10 minutes. I stood there in my dining room, looking at that beautiful Thanksgiving feast that no one was going to eat, and I felt something inside me break. Not just my heart, though that was shattered too. Something deeper. Some fundamental belief I'd had about family, about loyalty, about the meaning of the work I'd been doing my entire adult life. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't even the money, though $28 million was more than I'd ever dreamed of. It was that he thought so little of me that he believed I'd just roll over and let him take everything I'd built. That he could announce it at Thanksgiving dinner like it was already settled, like my opinion didn't matter, like 43 years of blood and sweat and sacrifice meant nothing. But here's what Danny didn't know about his old man. Here's what he forgot in his rush to cash out and get rich. I didn't build Carpenter Sons Construction by being a pushover. I built it by being smarter, tougher, and more stubborn than every other contractor in a 50-mile radius. I built it by outworking men half my age and outthinking men with twice my education. I built it by never, ever giving up, no matter how impossible things seemed, and I wasn't about to start giving up now. The next morning, I drove to the office early. It was the Friday after Thanksgiving, so the place was mostly empty. Just me in silence and the smell of coffee from the pot I'd started. I sat at my desk, the same desk I'd used for 30 years, and I started making phone calls. The first call was to my lawyer, Jim Patterson. He'd been handling the company's legal work for 15 years, ever since his predecessor retired. Good man, honest, and he understood construction law better than anyone in the state. "Jim, it's Franklin. I need to see you today. Emergency." "Franklin? It's 6 in the morning, and it's the day after Thanksgiving." "I know what day it is. My son is trying to steal my business. Can you be in the office in an hour?" There was a pause. "I'll be there in 45 minutes. That's the thing about having the right people in your corner. They show up when you need them." While I waited for Jim, I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I went through every single legal document related to the ownership of Carpenter Sons Construction, articles of incorporation, partnership agreements, stock certificates, everything. What I found made my blood run cold and my heart race at the same time. Danny was right about one thing. I'd never formally transferred ownership to him. But what he didn't understand, what he'd forgotten in his greed, was exactly how the company was structured. Carpenter Sons Construction wasn't just a simple corporation. It was a complex entity that I'd set up years ago on the advice of a tax attorney who specialized in family businesses. The company was structured as a holding company that owned several smaller entities. The construction business itself, the equipment leasing company, the real estate holdings where we stored our equipment and materials, even the small trucking company that handled our deliveries. Each entity was owned by the holding company, and I owned 91% of the holding company. Danny owned 9%. Just 9%. Enough to make him feel involved, enough to give him some stake in the business, but nowhere near enough to make any major decisions without my approval. The investors could offer all they wanted, but they couldn't buy something Danny didn't actually own. When Jim arrived, I had all the documents spread out on the conference table. He took one look at my face and poured himself a large cup of coffee. "Tell me everything," he said. I told him about Thanksgiving dinner, about Danny's announcement, about the $28 million offer, about the retirement home and the monthly allowance. Jim listened without interrupting, taking notes on his legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he started going through the documents, checking dates and signatures and corporate filings. "Franklin," he said finally, "your son can't sell this business without your approval. He doesn't have the legal authority." "I know that. What I want to know is how he thinks he can." Jim found the answer about an hour later, buried in a stack of papers that had been filed with the State Corporate Commission 6 months earlier. Danny had attempted to file documents that would have transferred majority control of the company to him, claiming that I had become mentally incompetent due to my age. Mentally incompetent. My own son had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my business. The filing had been rejected because it required a court order and medical documentation, but the fact that he'd tried it made everything clear. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision announced at Thanksgiving. This was a months-long conspiracy to steal everything I'd built. "Jim," I said, "I want to know everything. Every meeting Danny's had with these investors. Every document he's signed. Every phone call he's made. I want to know what he's promised them and what they think they're buying. Franklin, that could take weeks, and it'll cost. I don't care what it costs. I want to know everything." "And then what? You file a lawsuit. You could drag this out for years and spend hundreds of thousands in legal fees. I looked at Jim, and I could see he didn't understand. This wasn't about the money anymore. This wasn't even about the business, not really. This was about a father who'd been betrayed by his own son, and I wasn't going to let that betrayal stand. No lawsuit, I said. I've got a better idea. The next 2 weeks were the most educational of my life. Jim hired a private investigator, a forensic accountant, and a corporate research firm. We pulled phone records, email communications, financial documents, meeting schedules, travel records. By the time we were done, I knew more about my son's business dealings than he probably knew himself. Here's what I learned. The investors weren't some faceless corporate entity. They were a group of local businessmen who'd been trying to break into the construction market for years, led by a man named Vincent Torres, who owned 3 successful restaurants and wanted to diversify his holdings. They'd approached Danny directly, not through any kind of formal process. Danny had been meeting with them regularly since April. Not May like he'd told me. April. And these weren't casual conversations. They'd drawn up detailed business plans, conducted financial analyses, even started preliminary negotiations with potential clients who were interested in switching their business to a Torres-owned construction company. The $28 million offer was real, but it came with conditions. Torres and his group weren't just buying the business. They were buying the client relationships, the existing contracts, the equipment, the real estate, everything. They planned to keep the Carpenter Sons name for credibility but gradually phase it out in favor of their own branding. Most importantly, they had no intention of keeping me involved in any capacity. Danny had told them I was in early-stage dementia and would likely need to be placed in managed care within the next year. He'd promised them a clean transition with no interference from the previous owner. Early-stage dementia. My son had told complete strangers that I had early-stage dementia. But here's the part that really got to me. Danny had already spent money. A lot of money. Money he didn't have. Thinking the sale was guaranteed, he'd made some significant purchases. A new house, not just any house, but a $2 million mansion in the most expensive part of town. 2 new cars, a boat, a membership at an exclusive country club. He'd even put deposits down on private school tuition for all 3 kids. He'd borrowed against the anticipated sale proceeds, using the promise of $28 million to secure loans for almost $3 million in immediate expenses. If the sale fell through, he'd be ruined. That's when I realized something. Danny had backed himself into a corner. He needed this sale to happen, not just because he wanted the money, but because he'd already committed to spending money he didn't have. He was probably more desperate than greedy at this point. But desperation makes people dangerous, and I was about to find out just how dangerous my son could be. On a Tuesday morning in early December, I got a call from Rebecca. She was crying, which immediately put me on alert because Rebecca had always been the tough one in the family. "Dad, you need to know something. Danny came to see me yesterday." "What did he want?" He wanted me to sign an affidavit saying that you've been acting strange lately, that you've been forgetful and confused and making bad decisions." The son of a bitch was building a case for incompetency, using his own sister to do it. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to go to hell, Dad, but he said if I didn't help him, he'd make sure I never saw my grandchildren again. He said Sarah was already on board with cutting off contact with anyone who didn't support their decision, using the grandchildren as weapons. That's when I knew Danny had crossed a line he could never come back from. Rebecca, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call Danny and tell him you've changed your mind. Tell him you'll sign whatever he wants, but you want to meet with him and Sarah first to discuss the details. Dad, I'm not going to... Trust me, sweetheart. I need him to think you're cooperating. Can you do that for me?" 3 days later, Rebecca called Danny and arranged a meeting at a restaurant downtown. What Danny didn't know was that she was wearing a wire, courtesy of the private investigator Jim had hired. The recording from that meeting was more damning than anything we could have hoped for. Danny laid out the entire plan in detail, including the fake medical assessments he was planning to get, the witnesses he'd lined up to testify about my supposed mental decline, and the timeline for having me declared incompetent. But the most chilling part was what he said about me personally. The old man's lived long enough. Danny's voice came through crystal clear on the recording. He's had his time. This is our time now, and I'm not going to let his stubbornness ruin it for my family. If he won't step aside gracefully, then we'll make him step aside. Rebecca's voice was shaky when she asked, "What do you mean, make him?" "I mean whatever it takes, Becca. He's 70 years old. How many good years does he have left anyway? 5? 10? Why should Sarah and the kids have to wait for him to die to get what's rightfully theirs?" Rightfully theirs? The business I'd built from nothing, working 18-hour days for 43 years, was rightfully theirs. When Jim played me that recording, I sat in his office for a long time without saying anything. Finally, he asked, "What do you want to do, Franklin?" I looked at him and I could see he was expecting me to say we should take this to the police, or file for a restraining order, or start a lawsuit. Instead, I said something that surprised both of us. "I want to sell the business. Franklin, not to Torres and his group. I want to sell it to someone else. Someone Danny would never expect." "Who?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "My biggest competitor." Hartwell Construction had been trying to buy me out for 20 years. Jack Hartwell and I had a complicated relationship. We'd been rivals in business, but friends personally. He'd always said that if I ever wanted to retire, he'd be interested in talking. Well, now I was ready to talk. The next morning I called Jack directly. "Jack, it's Franklin Carpenter. You still interested in buying my business?" "Franklin, I've been interested for 2 decades. What changed your mind?" "It's a long story. Can we meet today?" "I'll clear my schedule. Your office or mine?" "Neutral ground. How about that diner on Route 12 where we used to grab coffee after the monthly contractors' meetings?" "I'll see you there in an hour." Jack Hartwell was 3 years older than me, which put him just past 70. He'd built his business the same way I'd built mine, through hard work, smart decisions, and treating people fairly. We'd bid against each other on hundreds of projects over the years, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always with respect for each other. When I told him what Danny was trying to do, Jack's face went through a range of expressions: surprise, anger, disgust, and finally, something that looked like pity. "Jesus, Franklin, your own son?" "My own son." "What do you want to do about it?" I told him my plan. Jack listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You know this will destroy your relationship with your son permanently," he said. "Jack, my son tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my business and put me in a nursing home. The relationship is already destroyed. What about your grandchildren?" That was the part that hurt the most to think about. Emma, Jake, and little Lily. I loved them more than life itself, but Danny was already using them as weapons against me. If I didn't act now, I'd lose them anyway. I'll figure out how to maintain a relationship with them later. Right now, I have to protect what I've built. Jack leaned back in his booth and studied my face. "How much do you want for the business?" "Market value. I'll have it appraised by 3 independent firms. We'll take the average, and that's the price. No family discount, no long-time competitor discount." "This is business, Jack. Clean business between 2 professionals who respect each other." "When do you want to close?" "As soon as possible. And Jack, I want you to make Danny an offer for his 9%. A fair offer, but not a generous one. I want him bought out completely." "You want him gone?" "I want him gone." We shook hands on it right there in that diner booth. The same handshake that had sealed dozens of deals between us over the years, but this one felt different. This one felt like revenge. The appraisals came in at an average of $32 million. $4 million more than Torres had offered. Jack agreed to the price without negotiating, which told me he understood this was about more than money for both of us. The lawyers drew up the paperwork over the next week. Clean, simple, professional. Hartwell Construction would acquire all assets of Carpenter Sons Construction, including equipment, real estate, existing contracts, and client relationships. Jack would retain most of the employees, honor all existing agreements, and maintain the quality standards that both companies were known for. Danny's 9% stake would be purchased for $2.9 million, paid out over 5 years at 3% interest. Not generous, but fair. The closing was scheduled for December 23rd. I chose the date deliberately. On December 20th, I called Danny. It was the first time we'd spoken since Thanksgiving. "Dad." His voice was cold, professional. "Danny, I need you to come to the office tomorrow morning at 9. We need to discuss the business." "I told you. We'll communicate through our lawyers." "This isn't about your scheme to steal the company. This is about something else, something you need to hear in person." There was a long pause. "What do you mean?" "Just be there at 9. Bring Sarah if you want." He was there at 8:50 alone. I was waiting in the conference room with Jim Patterson and a stack of legal documents. "What's this about?" Danny asked, but I could see in his eyes that he already suspected something. "Sit down, son." He sat, but he didn't look comfortable. 3 weeks ago, you announced that you were selling my business out from under me. You told me I was too old to be involved, that I was a liability, that I should be grateful for a spot in a nursing home and a monthly allowance. "Dad, I'm not finished." My voice was quiet, but it cut through his interruption like a blade. "You also filed paperwork trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. You lied to potential investors about my health. You conspired with your sister to gather false testimony about my mental state. And you borrowed $3 million against money you didn't have, assuming you could force me out of my own business." Danny's face had gone pale, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I don't know what you think I know everything, Danny. Every meeting, every phone call, every document. I know about your new house, your new cars, your country club membership. I know about the private school deposits and the boat you bought. I know exactly how much money you've already spent, and exactly how desperate you are for this sale to go through." Now his hands were shaking. "Dad, let me explain." "No need to explain. I understand perfectly. You decided that $28 million was more important than your relationship with your father. You decided that your greed was more important than 43 years of my work. You decided that your immediate gratification was more important than the legacy I was trying to build for your children." I slid the first document across the table to him. "What you didn't count on was your old man being smarter than you gave him credit for." Danny picked up the document and started reading. I watched his face as he realized what he was looking at. This is a sale agreement." "That's right. Carpenter Sons Construction was sold yesterday to Hartwell Construction for $32 million. The color drained completely from his face. You can't sell without my approval." "Actually, I can. I own 91% of the company, remember? You only need majority approval for a sale, and I am the majority." But the Torres deal, we had an agreement." "You had an agreement. I never signed anything. I never agreed to anything. You made promises you had no authority to make to people you had no business talking to." I slid the second document across the table. "However, Jack Hartwell has agreed to purchase your 9% stake in the company for $2.9 million, paid out over 5 years. It's a fair offer, Danny. More fair than you deserve, given what you tried to do to me." Danny was staring at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. $2.9 million over 5 years? That's not enough. I need the money now. I have commitments. I have loans. That sounds like a personal problem. Dad, you don't understand. I owe almost $3 million. If I don't get a lump sum payment, I'll lose everything. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my son. Really looked at him. This man I'd raised, taught, trusted with my life's work. This man who'd been willing to destroy me for money. "Danny, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You borrowed $3 million against money you didn't actually have, assuming you could force me to sell my business to cover your debts. Is that about right?" He nodded, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, He looked like the scared little boy I remembered from his childhood. And now you're asking me to help you out of the hole you dug for yourself while trying to steal from me. Dad, please, I made a mistake. I know I made a mistake. But if you don't help me, I'll lose the house, the cars, everything. Sarah will leave me. I'll lose my kids. There it was. The truth behind all the scheming and plotting and betrayal. Danny hadn't just been greedy. He'd been stupid. He'd gotten in over his head financially and saw stealing my business as his only way out. Part of me felt sorry for him. The father in me wanted to help, wanted to find a way to save him from his own foolishness. But the businessman in me, the part of me that had learned hard lessons about consequences and accountability, knew better. Son, you should have thought about all of that before you tried to have me declared mentally incompetent. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the construction yard where crews were loading equipment for the day's jobs. Soon this would all belong to Jack Hartwell, but the employees would keep their jobs, the clients would continue to receive quality work, and the legacy would continue. Just not with my name on it. There is one thing I can do for you, I said without turning around. Anything, Dad. Please. Jack Hartwell is looking for experienced project managers. I could put in a word for you. The silence behind me was deafening. Finally, Danny spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper. You want me to work for the man who bought our company? I want you to work for a living instead of trying to steal for a living. Jack's a good man. He'll treat you fairly if you work hard and prove yourself. Dad, I can't work for someone else after running this company for 20 years. I turned back to face him. Danny, you were never running this company. You were working for this company. There's a difference, and the fact that you don't understand that difference is exactly why you're in this situation. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing everything. The reality of his situation, the consequences of his choices, the fact that his plan had not just failed but backfired spectacularly. What about the Torres deal? What am I supposed to tell them? Tell them the truth. Tell them the company was sold to someone else by the actual owner. Tell them you're sorry you wasted their time by making promises you had no authority to make. They're going to be furious. They might sue. They might. That's another personal problem you'll have to figure out. Jim Patterson had been sitting quietly through this entire conversation, but now he cleared his throat. Danny, there's something else you need to understand. Your father would have been well within his rights to file criminal charges against you for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. He's chosen not to do that, but that decision could change if you make any trouble for the sale or cause problems for the new owners. Danny looked at Jim, then back at me. Criminal charges? Filing false documents with the state, attempting to defraud investors, conspiracy to commit fraud. Jim's been very thorough in documenting everything you've done over the past 8 months. For the first time, Danny seemed to understand the full scope of what he'd gotten himself into. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was serious legal trouble that could result in prison time. Dad, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. I studied his face, trying to determine if the apology was genuine or just another manipulation. After a long moment, I decided it didn't matter. Danny, I'm going to give you some advice that you can take or leave. Go home, sit down with Sarah, and figure out how to get out of the financial hole you've dug. Sell the house, sell the cars, take the kids out of private school, cancel the country club membership, live within your means, and work your way back to financial stability like an adult. And if I do that, what happens between us? That was the question I'd been dreading. What did happen between us now? Could there ever be forgiveness for this level of betrayal? Could we ever have a normal father-son relationship again? I don't know, son. I honestly don't know. What you did, what you tried to do, that's not something I can just forget. But maybe someday. I looked at this man who was my son, who carried my name, who I'd loved and taught and trusted, and I felt something break inside me that I knew would never fully heal. Maybe someday, I said. But we both knew I was just being kind. Danny left that morning with the buyout papers unsigned. He needed time to think, he said. Time to talk to Sarah. Time to figure out his options. I told him he had until the end of the week to decide, but the sale was going through regardless. 2 days later, on December 23rd, the sale closed. Jack Hartwell became the owner of what had been Carpenter Sons Construction for 43 years. The check for $32 million was deposited into my personal account, making me, at age 67, wealthier than I'd ever dreamed possible. But I felt hollow, empty, like I'd won the battle but lost something much more important in the process. Danny never did take the job with Jack Hartwell. He signed the buyout papers on the last possible day, agreeing to the 5-year payment plan for his minority stake. Then he disappeared. Not literally, I knew where he was. But he cut off all contact with me, changed his phone number, blocked my email, returned my letters unopened. Sarah brought the kids by exactly once, in February, and the visit was awkward and painful for everyone involved. Emma, who was 12 and old enough to understand that something terrible had happened between her grandfather and her father, spent the entire visit trying not to cry. Jake and Lily were confused and distant, clearly having been told not to get too attached to Grandpa. Sarah tried to explain, tried to play peacemaker, but her heart wasn't in it. "He's humiliated, Franklin," she said as they were leaving. "He feels like you destroyed his life." "I didn't destroy his life, Sarah. I protected mine." "I know that. But you have to understand how this looks to him. Everyone in town knows what happened. Everyone knows he tried to sell a business he didn't own and had to go crawling back to his father for help. He can't show his face anywhere without people talking." She was right, of course. In a town the size of ours, this kind of drama didn't stay secret for long. The construction community was particularly close-knit, and word of Danny's attempted coup had spread quickly. His reputation was ruined, not just as a businessman but as a person. "Sarah, he did this to himself." "I know. But he's still your son. And those kids? They're losing their grandfather because of choices they had nothing to do with." That hit me harder than anything else she could have said. Because she was right. Emma, Jake, and little Lily were paying the price for their father's greed and stupidity, and there wasn't anything I could do about it without enabling the very behavior that had caused this mess in the first place. After they left that day, I sat in my empty house and wondered if I'd made the right choice. I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, but I'd lost my son and my grandchildren in the process. Was revenge really worth that price? But then I remembered Thanksgiving dinner. I remembered the look in Danny's eyes when he announced that he was selling my business out from under me. I remembered him calling me a liability, planning to put me in a nursing home, lying about my mental health to strangers. I remembered the recording of him saying I'd lived long enough. No, I decided. I hadn't been seeking revenge. I'd been protecting myself from someone who happened to be related to me by blood, but had proven that blood meant nothing to him when money was involved. The months that followed were strange. I'd gone from working 60-hour weeks to having nothing but time on my hands. I tried traveling, tried hobbies, tried volunteering, but nothing filled the void left by the business I'd built and lost and sold. Jack Hartwell kept me informed about how things were going. The transition had been smooth, the employees were adapting well to new ownership, and the clients were satisfied with the continued quality of work. He'd kept the Carpenter name on some of the trucks and equipment, partly out of respect for the legacy and partly because it still carried weight in the community. "Any word from Danny?" Jack asked during one of our monthly lunches. "Nothing. Sarah brings the kids by occasionally, but it's awkward for everyone. I heard he took a job with Morrison Development over in Capital City." Morrison Development. They were a mid-level commercial contractor, nothing special. For someone who'd been second in command at one of the most successful construction companies in the region, it had to be a humbling experience. "How's he doing there?" "From what I hear, not great. Apparently he's having trouble adjusting to not being in charge. Keeps trying to make decisions above his pay grade." That sounded like Danny. He'd gotten used to having authority, to being the boss's son, to people deferring to his judgment. Starting over as just another employee at a different company had to be killing his ego. Jack, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you think I was too hard on him? Jack was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and looking out the window at the traffic passing by on Main Street. Franklin, if one of my sons had tried to do to me what Danny tried to do to you, I'd have had him arrested. You showed remarkable restraint. But he's still my son. And you're still his father. The question is, what kind of father enables theft and fraud just because it's committed by family? That became my answer whenever guilt started creeping in. I wasn't punishing Danny for being a bad son. I was refusing to reward him for being a criminal who happened to share my DNA. But the guilt did creep in, especially when I thought about the grandchildren. Emma had been particularly close to me before all this happened. She was smart, curious, interested in how things worked. I'd been teaching her about construction, about business, about the satisfaction that comes from building something with your own hands. Now I barely saw her, and when I did, she was polite but distant. Jake and Lily were younger and more adaptable, but I could see the confusion in their eyes. They didn't understand why Grandpa and Daddy didn't talk anymore, why family gatherings had stopped, why everything had changed so suddenly. The worst part was knowing that Danny was probably poisoning them against me, telling them that Grandpa was mean, that Grandpa had hurt their family, that Grandpa didn't love them anymore. Kids that age believe what their parents tell them, and Danny had every reason to want them to hate me. But I couldn't fix that without capitulating to his demands, and capitulating would have meant validating everything he'd tried to do. It would have taught my grandchildren that family loyalty meant letting people steal from you, that love meant enabling bad behavior, that consequences don't apply when you're related to your victims. So I lived with the guilt and the loneliness and the knowledge that I'd probably never have a normal relationship with Danny's children again. That's how things stood for almost 2 years. Danny working at Morrison Development, struggling to make ends meet on a regular salary while paying off the debts he'd accumulated expecting to be a multimillionaire. Me rattling around in my empty house, wealthy but isolated, wondering if winning had been worth the cost. Then in October of 2024, everything changed again. I got a call from Sarah at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. She was crying, which immediately put me on alert. Franklin, I need to talk to you. Can you meet me somewhere private? What's wrong? Is it one of the kids? No, the kids are fine. It's Danny. We met at a coffee shop on the other side of town, somewhere we weren't likely to run into anyone we knew. Sarah looked terrible, exhausted, stressed, like she'd been crying for days. Danny's been arrested, she said without preamble. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Arrested for what? Embezzlement. At Morrison Development. They're saying he stole almost $400,000 over the past 18 months. $400,000. My son, who'd already destroyed his life trying to steal from me, had apparently learned nothing from the experience. How? He was in charge of purchasing materials for their projects. Apparently, he was setting up fake vendor accounts, approving payments to companies that didn't exist, then funneling the money into personal accounts. Jesus Christ. That was sophisticated fraud, the kind that required planning and careful execution over months or years. This wasn't a desperate moment of weakness. This was systematic criminal behavior. Sarah, I'm sorry, I know this is... Franklin, he's going to prison. She was crying again, harder now. They're talking about 5 to 10 years. Maybe more if they can prove it was a pattern going back to when he worked for you. That stopped me cold. What do you mean when he worked for me? The investigators are looking into all his previous employment. They want to know if he was stealing from Carpenter Sons too. The possibility had never occurred to me, but now that she'd mentioned it, I realized it should have. If Danny was capable of embezzling from Morrison Development, if he was capable of trying to steal the entire business from me, what else had he been capable of over the 22 years he'd worked for me? Franklin, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I nodded. If they find evidence that Danny was stealing from your company, will you press charges? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. If I said yes, I'd be ensuring that my son went to prison for even longer. If I said no, I'd be enabling the same behavior that had gotten us into this mess in the first place. Sarah, I can't answer that until I know what they find. Please, I'm begging you. He's made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he's still the father of my children. If you press charges, if you pile onto what he's already facing, he'll never get out of prison. Emma, Jake, and Lily will grow up without a father. The irony wasn't lost on me. Danny had been willing to destroy my life for money, but now I was being asked to protect his life for the sake of family. What does Danny say about all this? He says he's innocent. He says Morrison Development is trying to make him a scapegoat for their own financial problems. I looked at Sarah's face and realized she didn't believe him. She was defending him because he was her husband and the father of her children, but she knew he was guilty. Sarah, can I ask you something? Of course. Did you know what he was planning when he announced the sale at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup like it held the answers to all her problems. I knew he was meeting with investors, she said finally. I knew he was unhappy with how little authority you were giving him in the business, but I didn't know he was planning to force you out completely. I thought it would be more of a partnership arrangement. And when he told you about trying to have me declared incompetent? I told him he was insane. I told him it would destroy our family. But he said you were being stubborn and unreasonable, that this was the only way to make you see sense. Did you know about the money he borrowed? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Not all of it. I knew about the house and the cars, but I didn't know about the boat or the country club or the school deposits. When I found out how much we owed, I begged him to call off the whole thing, to go to you and ask for help instead of trying to force you out. What did he say? He said it was too late. He said he'd burned too many bridges, and the only way forward was through. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke again. Franklin, I know you have every right to hate Danny for what he tried to do to you. I know you have every right to want him to face the consequences of his choices. But I'm asking you, as the mother of your grandchildren, to please consider showing mercy if they find evidence of stealing from your company. I looked at this woman who'd been my daughter-in-law for 15 years, who'd given me 3 beautiful grandchildren, who was now facing the possibility of raising those children alone while their father sat in prison. Sarah, I need to think about this. I need to understand what we're dealing with before I can make any promises. I understand, but please remember that whatever Danny did, whatever mistakes he made, Emma, Jake, and Lily are innocent. They don't deserve to lose their father forever because of his poor choices. After Sarah left, I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, trying to process what I'd learned. My son wasn't just a failed businessman or a greedy opportunist. He was apparently a systematic criminal who'd been stealing money for at least 18 months, possibly longer. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I called Jim Patterson from the parking lot. Jim, it's Franklin. I need you to do me a favor. What do you need? I need you to hire a forensic accountant to go through every financial record from Carpenter Sons for the past 5 years. Every vendor payment, every expense account, every petty cash disbursement. I want to know if Danny was stealing from me. Franklin, are you sure you want to know? If we find something, I'm sure. And Jim, I want this done quietly. No contact with law enforcement unless I specifically authorize it. Understood. How soon do you need this? As soon as possible. Danny's situation is moving fast, and I need to know what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions about cooperation with the prosecutors. The forensic accountant, a woman named Patricia Chen, was thorough and discreet. She spent 3 weeks going through 5 years of financial records, cross-referencing vendor payments with actual deliveries, checking expense account receipts against company policies, analyzing patterns in cash flow and inventory management. What she found made me sick to my stomach. Danny had been stealing from me for at least 4 years, possibly longer. The methods were sophisticated and carefully designed to avoid detection. Fake vendor accounts, inflated material costs, kickbacks from real vendors who were overcharging the company in exchange for guaranteed contracts, expense account fraud, even outright theft of equipment that was then sold to third parties. The total amount was staggering, just over $1.2 million over 4 years. $1.2 million. My own son had stolen more than $1 million from me while I was teaching him the business, trusting him with increasing responsibility, and planning to eventually turn the company over to him. But here's the part that really got to me. The theft had accelerated significantly in the months leading up to his attempted coup at Thanksgiving. He hadn't just been planning to steal the entire business from me. He'd been systematically looting it while making those plans. Patricia's report was meticulous and damning. She documented every fraudulent transaction, traced every fake vendor payment, identified every piece of equipment that had been sold illegally. If I turned this over to prosecutors, Danny wouldn't just be facing 5 to 10 years for the Morrison development embezzlement. He'd be looking at another 10 to 15 years for what he'd done to me. I took the report home and spent the weekend reading through it, trying to reconcile the man described in these pages with the son I'd raised and loved. The level of planning and deception required for this kind of systematic theft was staggering. This wasn't someone making desperate mistakes. This was someone who'd been living a double life for years. On Monday morning, I called Sarah and asked her to meet me again. Same coffee shop, same booth. "Did you find something?" she asked as soon as she sat down. I slid a summary of Patricia's findings across the table. Sarah read it in silence, her face growing paler with each page. "Oh my God," she whispered. $1 million? $1.2 million, actually. Franklin, I swear to you I had no idea. I knew he was meeting with vendors. I knew he was handling more of the purchasing, but I never imagined. I believed her. Sarah wasn't sophisticated enough to help plan something like this, and she wasn't a good enough actress to fake the shock and horror on her face. "Sarah, I need to ask you something else. The money Danny borrowed against the anticipated sale, where did he think he was going to get the cash to service those loans before the sale went through?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her putting the pieces together. "He said he had some savings set aside. He said he'd been putting money away for years in preparation for taking over the business. Savings from stealing from me." She nodded, tears starting again. "He was planning to use the money he'd stolen from you to make payments on the money he'd borrowed to buy things he expected to pay for by stealing your business. That's about the size of it." We sat in silence while Sarah processed the full scope of her husband's criminal behavior. Finally, she looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "What are you going to do?" That was the million-dollar question, literally. What was I going to do with evidence that my son had been systematically stealing from me for years? "Sarah, I want you to understand something. If I turn this information over to the prosecutors, Danny will probably spend the next 20 years in prison. Emma, Jake, and Lily will be in their 30s before their father gets out. I understand. But if I don't turn it over, I'm essentially letting him get away with stealing more than $1 million from me. I'm enabling the same behavior that got us into this mess in the first place. I know. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer you a choice." Sarah looked up at me with something that might have been hope. "I will not voluntarily provide this information to the prosecutors. I will not press additional charges against Danny for what he stole from me. But there are conditions." "What conditions?" "First, Danny has to plead guilty to the charges he's already facing. No trial, no fighting the charges, no claiming he's innocent or being framed. He takes responsibility for what he did at Morrison Development." "Okay, what else?" "Second, he has to pay restitution. Not just to Morrison Development, but to me. The full $1.2 million plus interest." "Franklin, there's no way we can come up with that kind of money. I'm not expecting you to come up with it all at once, but I want a formal agreement that he owes me the money, and I want payments to start as soon as he gets out of prison and finds employment." "How much per month?" "Whatever he can afford after taking care of his family's basic needs." I'm not looking to destroy your ability to survive, but I am looking for acknowledgement that what he took from me wasn't his to take. Sarah nodded. What's the third condition? He has to write letters to Emma, Jake, and Lily explaining what he did and why he did it. Age-appropriate explanations, but honest ones. I don't want them growing up thinking their father was innocent or that their grandfather was the bad guy in this situation. Franklin, I'm not asking him to destroy his relationship with his children, Sarah. I'm asking him to take responsibility for his actions and help them understand why their family fell apart. They deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to hear it from him. And if he agrees to all of this, then I keep Patricia's report locked away, and the prosecutors never learn about the additional theft. Danny serves whatever sentence he gets for the Morrison development charges, and when he gets out, he starts over with a clean slate as far as I'm concerned. Sarah was quiet for a long time, thinking through the implications. And if he doesn't agree, then I turn everything over to the prosecutors and let the justice system handle it. Danny faces additional charges for stealing from me, probably gets another 10 to 15 years added to his sentence, and you're on your own. That's not really a choice. It's exactly as much choice as he gave me at Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. Sarah understood the parallel. Danny had presented his plans as a fait accompli, expecting me to accept whatever terms he offered. Now I was returning the favor. I'll talk to him, she said. But Franklin, he's not in a good place right now. He's angry and scared and looking for someone to blame for everything that's gone wrong. Who's he blaming? You, mostly. He says if you just agreed to sell the business to Torres like he wanted, none of this would have happened. He says you forced him into a corner and this is really your fault. Even after everything that had happened, after being caught stealing from 2 different companies, Danny was still trying to make himself the victim in this story. Sarah, you know that's not true. I know. But he's convinced himself that it is. It's easier than accepting responsibility for his own choices. Well, that's going to have to change if he wants my cooperation in keeping this quiet. 3 days later, Sarah called to tell me that Danny had agreed to my terms. He would plead guilty to the embezzlement charges, sign a restitution agreement for the money he'd stolen from me, and write explanatory letters to his children. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. I wasn't planning to attend, but Jim Patterson thought I should be there as a show of support for the plea agreement. If you're there and you don't object to the sentence, it sends a signal to the judge that the community considers this an appropriate resolution. I'm not sure I consider it appropriate. I think he's getting off easy. Maybe. But if he violates the terms of your agreement, you can always change your mind about pressing additional charges. So I went to the courthouse on a gray November morning and sat in the back row of the gallery while my son stood before a judge and admitted that he was a thief. The hearing was brief and procedural. Danny pleaded guilty to embezzling $387,000 from Morrison Development over 18 months. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 2.5 years if he showed good behavior and participated in rehabilitation programs. 4 years. For stealing almost $400,000, my son was going to prison for 4 years. As the bailiff led Danny away in handcuffs, he turned and looked back at the gallery. His eyes found mine, and for just a moment I saw something that looked like remorse. Or maybe it was just fear. Either way, it was too little, too late. After the hearing, Sarah and I talked briefly in the courthouse hallway. He'll be eligible for parole in 30 months, she said. The kids will be 15, 13, and 10 when he gets out. That's not that old. They'll still have time to build a relationship with their father. If they want to. Emma's already asking a lot of questions about why Daddy went away, and she's smart enough to figure out that the official story doesn't add up. What are you telling them? The truth, as much as they can handle. That Daddy made some very bad choices and has to face the consequences, but also that we all still love him and will be here when he comes home. And the letters? He's working on them. It's hard for him to figure out how to explain this to children without completely destroying their image of him. I understood that struggle, but it wasn't my problem to solve. Danny had created this situation with his choices, and now he had to figure out how to live with the consequences. Sarah, there's something else we need to discuss. What? Your financial situation. With Danny in prison, how are you going to support yourself and the kids? I've been thinking about that. I'll probably have to sell the house, move somewhere smaller, maybe get a job, though I haven't worked since Emma was born. Sarah had been a stay-at-home mom for 12 years, supported by Danny's income from the construction business. Now she was facing the prospect of single parenthood with no recent work experience and 3 children to support. I have a proposal, I said. I'd like to help. She looked at me suspiciously. What kind of help? Financial help. A monthly allowance to cover basic expenses, housing, food, utilities, school expenses. Enough so you don't have to uproot the kids or struggle to make ends meet while Danny's away. Why would you do that? Because those children are my grandchildren, and they didn't choose to have a father who's a thief. They shouldn't have to suffer because of his poor decisions. What's the catch? Smart woman. There was always a catch. No catch, exactly. But I want to be part of their lives again. I want to see them regularly, spend time with them, be their grandfather instead of just the man who sent their father to prison. Danny won't like that. Danny's opinion is not my primary concern right now. My primary concern is maintaining a relationship with Emma, Jake, and Lily. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Pride versus practicality, loyalty to her husband versus the best interests of her children. How much are we talking about? Enough to cover a decent rental house, food, utilities, car payments, school expenses, and some discretionary spending. Maybe $4,000 a month. $4,000 a month was more than many families lived on total, but it was a fraction of what I could afford, and it would ensure that my grandchildren had stability during their father's absence. And I'd have to let you see the kids? I'd want to see them regularly, but I'm not talking about forcing anything. If they don't want to see me, we'll figure out how to handle that. But I'd like the opportunity to rebuild those relationships. I need to think about this. Of course. But Sarah, understand that this offer has an expiration date. If I'm going to help support those children, I need to be part of their lives. I'm not interested in being a silent ATM. 2 weeks later, Sarah called and accepted my offer. She'd found a nice rental house in the same school district, close enough to their old neighborhood that the kids wouldn't have to change schools or lose touch with their friends. She'd also started looking for part-time work, something she could do while the kids were in school. When do you want to see them? She asked. This weekend, if possible. I thought maybe I could take them to lunch and then do something fun. Mini golf or bowling or whatever they're interested in these days. Emma might be difficult. She's been asking a lot of questions about what really happened between you and Danny. What have you told her? That it's complicated and she'll understand better when she's older. But she's 12, Franklin. She's not stupid, and she's not going to be satisfied with vague answers much longer. Then maybe it's time to start giving her some real answers. That Saturday, I picked up all 3 kids for what felt like the first normal family outing we'd had in almost 2 years. Emma was quiet and watchful, clearly suspicious of my motives. Jake was excited to see me but confused about why it had been so long. Lily, who was now 9, seemed to have forgotten why she was supposed to be mad at me and was just happy to spend time with her grandfather. We went to lunch at a family restaurant, then spent the afternoon at a local arcade. For a few hours it felt like old times. I watched Jake play skee-ball, helped Lily with a claw machine, and listened to Emma talk about school and her friends and her plans for the future. But as I was driving them home, Emma finally asked the question I'd been expecting. Grandpa, why did Daddy really go to prison? I looked in the rearview mirror at her serious 12-year-old face and made a decision. Your father stole money from the company where he worked, but why did you and Daddy stop talking before that happened? Smart girl. She'd connected the dots and realized that the family problems had started long before Danny's arrest. Your father tried to steal my business. He wanted to sell it without asking me and keep all the money for himself. But wasn't it partly his business too? A very small part of it. But he wanted all of it. Emma was quiet for a few minutes processing this information. Finally, she asked, "Is that why you sold it to someone else?" "Yes." "Are you glad you did that?" That was a harder question to answer. Was I glad I'd sold the business rather than let Danny steal it? Yes. Was I glad about the way everything had turned out? That was more complicated. "I'm glad I protected what I'd worked my whole life to build," I said finally. "But I'm not glad that it cost me my relationship with your father." "Do you think you'll ever be friends again?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I hope so, but your father hurt me very badly. And it's hard to forget something like that. But you still love him?" And there was the heart of it. Did I still love Danny after everything he'd done? I love the little boy I raised and the young man who worked beside me for so many years. But I don't like the person he became when he decided that money was more important than family. That's sad? Yes, it is sad. We drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. Emma seemed satisfied with my answers, and I felt like we'd taken a first step toward rebuilding our relationship. Over the next several months, I saw the kids regularly, every other weekend, sometimes more often. Sarah was working part-time at a medical office and seemed to be adjusting to single motherhood better than I'd expected. The kids were doing well in school, had maintained their friendships, and were gradually adapting to their father's absence. Emma and I talked more openly about what had happened between Danny and me. I didn't tell her everything. She didn't need to know about the attempted incompetency filing or the full extent of Danny's theft. But I was honest about the basic facts. Her father had tried to take something that didn't belong to him, and there had been consequences for that choice. Jake was more interested in the technical aspects of the construction business. He wanted to know how buildings were built, how cranes worked, how you knew if a foundation was strong enough. I started taking him to some of Jack Hartwell's job sites when he was available on school holidays. Lily was just happy to have her grandfather back in her life. She didn't ask difficult questions or seem particularly concerned about the adult drama that had split the family. She just wanted someone to read to her, play games with her, and listen to her stories about school and friends. It wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was good. Better than I'd dared to hope during those dark months when I thought I'd lost them forever. In the spring of 2025, I got an unexpected phone call. It was Danny, calling from prison. "Dad." His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "Danny, how are you holding up?" "I'm okay. The time's going by faster than I expected. I've been taking classes, working in the library, trying to stay busy." "That's good." There was a long pause, then, "Dad, I owe you an apology." I'd been waiting for this conversation for over 2 years, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure what to say. "Go on." "I was wrong. About everything. The way I handled the business, the way I treated you, the choices I made afterward. I was angry and greedy and stupid, and I hurt a lot of people who didn't deserve it." "Yes, you did. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back the money I stole or undo the damage I did to our family. But I needed you to know that I understand what I did was wrong." It was a start. Not enough, not nearly enough, but a start. "Danny, I appreciate you saying that. But I need you to understand something. An apology doesn't erase consequences. You're going to be paying for these choices for the rest of your life." "I know. Sarah told me about the restitution agreement. I'll honor it. When I get out, I'll get a job and start paying you back. It's not about the money, son. It's about accountability." "I understand." Another pause. Then, "Dad, how are the kids? Sarah tells me you've been spending time with them." "They're good. Emma's growing up fast, probably too fast. Jake's interested in construction, wants to know how everything works. Lily's just happy to be a kid." Are they okay with me being gone?" That was a loaded question. Were they okay? They were adapting, but they weren't okay. How could they be okay with their father being in prison? They miss you, I said, which was true, but they're strong kids, and Sarah's doing a good job with them. I wrote those letters you asked for, explaining what I did and why. Sarah has them. Good. When are you planning to give them to the kids? I don't know. Sarah thinks we should wait until they're older, until they can understand better. Danny, they already understand more than you think. Emma knows you stole money. She knows that's why you're in prison. What she doesn't understand is why you made those choices. How do I explain to my 12-year-old daughter that I was willing to destroy my own father for money? How do I tell her that I'm not the man she thought I was? You tell her the truth. You tell her that you made terrible mistakes, that you were wrong, and that you're sorry. You tell her that you love her, and that you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to be worthy of that love. And if she can't forgive me, then you live with that consequence too. But Danny, kids are more forgiving than adults. If you're honest with them, if you show them that you've learned from your mistakes, they'll probably find a way to love you anyway. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, his release date, his plans for finding work when he got out, the logistics of rebuilding his relationship with his family. It was a civil conversation, but it wasn't warm. Too much had happened. Too much trust had been broken for us to simply pick up where we'd left off before Thanksgiving dinner 2022. But it was a conversation. After more than 2 years of silence, we were talking again. That was something. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen thinking about forgiveness. Could I forgive Danny for what he'd tried to do to me? For the theft, the lies, the betrayal, the attempt to have me declared incompetent? Could I find a way back to loving my son despite everything he'd done? I wasn't sure. The wounds were deep, and some of them might never fully heal. But maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting what someone had done to you. Maybe it was about choosing not to let their actions define your relationship forever. Maybe it was about being willing to see if they'd changed, if they'd learned, if they were capable of being better than their worst moments. I was willing to find out. Danny was released from prison in August 2025, after serving 2.5 years of his 4-year sentence. Sarah picked him up from the correctional facility, and they spent a week together as a family before Danny called to ask if we could meet. We met at the same diner where Jack Hartwell and I had shaken hands on the sale of my business 3 years earlier. Danny looked older, thinner, worn down by his time in prison, but somehow more focused than I remembered him being before. Dad, thank you for agreeing to see me. How are you adjusting? It's strange. Everything's familiar but different at the same time. The kids are older. Sarah's more independent. I feel like I'm trying to fit back into a life that moved on without me. That's probably pretty accurate. I started a job yesterday, construction work with a small residential contractor. It's entry-level stuff, nothing like what I was doing before, but it's honest work. That's good. I wanted to talk to you about the restitution payments. My salary isn't much, but I can probably manage $500 a month to start. More as I get raises or find better work. $500 a month would mean it would take 200 years to pay back the $1.2 million he'd stolen from me. But I hadn't structured the restitution agreement to actually recover the money. I'd structured it to ensure that Danny understood he owed a debt. That sounds reasonable for now. Dad, I also wanted to talk to you about us, about whether there's a way for us to have a relationship again. I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation and entitlement that had characterized our interactions before his arrest. What I saw instead was exhaustion, genuine remorse, and something that looked like humility. What kind of relationship did you have in mind? I don't know. I know things can't go back to the way they were before. I know I don't deserve your trust, and I know it'll take years to earn it back if I ever can. But I'd like to try. Why? Why is this important to you now? Danny was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee and looking out the window at the parking lot where construction workers were grabbing breakfast before heading to their job sites. In prison, I had a lot of time to think about what I'd lost. Not just the money or the business or my freedom. I'd lost my relationship with my father. I damaged my marriage, traumatized my children, destroyed my reputation. And for what? For money I never even got to spend. You spent some of it. Yeah, I bought things, a house, cars, toys. But I never got to enjoy any of it because I was so focused on getting more. I was so consumed with what I thought I deserved that I couldn't appreciate what I actually had. And what did you have? A father who'd taught me everything he knew about business and life. A wife who loved me. 3 kids who thought I was a hero. A job that challenged me and paid well. A future that was bright and secure. He looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. I had everything, Dad. And I threw it all away because I wanted more. It was the first time I'd heard Danny take full responsibility for his choices without trying to blame circumstances or other people. It was also the first time I'd heard him express genuine gratitude for what he'd had, instead of resentment for what he'd lost. Prison changed you. Prison gave me perspective and time to read. I read a lot of books about business ethics, about family relationships, about the psychology of greed and entitlement. I learned some things about myself that I didn't like, such as that I'd developed a sense of entitlement that was completely disconnected from reality. I thought because I was your son, because I'd worked hard for the company, that I was owed something beyond what I'd already been given. I thought you were holding me back instead of building me up. What do you think now? Now I think you were preparing me to eventually take over the business, but you were doing it responsibly. You were making sure I was ready, that I understood all aspects of the operation, that I could handle the pressure and responsibility. But I was impatient. I wanted everything immediately. And the stealing? Danny's face darkened. The stealing started small, a few hundred here and there when money was tight, but it got easier each time and the amounts got larger. By the end, I was taking money just because I could, because I'd convinced myself that it was really my money anyway, since I was going to inherit the business eventually. That's not how inheritance works, son. I know that now. But at the time, I'd rationalized it completely. I thought I was just taking an advance on my future ownership. What about the systematic fraud? The fake vendors, the kickbacks, the equipment sales? That wasn't just taking advances. That was sophisticated criminal activity. Danny looked down at his hands, and I could see shame in his posture. By that point, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was stealing to cover up previous stealing, lying to cover up the lies. I was in so deep that I couldn't see a way out except to take more. Until you decided to steal the entire business. Yeah. I thought if I could force you into selling to Torres, I could pay back everything I'd stolen and no one would ever know. It would all just disappear into the sale proceeds. But you couldn't force me to sell. No. And when you sold to Jack Hartwell instead, I realized that all the money I'd stolen was going to be discovered during the transition. That's when I really panicked. Is that when you started stealing from Morrison Development? I started there thinking I could make enough to pay back what I owed you before it was discovered. But the amounts were so large and my salary was so much lower than what I'd been making. I got desperate. We sat in silence for a few minutes while I processed everything he'd told me. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. But honesty about past mistakes didn't automatically rebuild trust or repair relationships. Danny, I appreciate you being straightforward with me about what happened and why, but I need you to understand that knowing the reasons doesn't erase the consequences. I understand. I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you completely again. What you did, the planning, the deception, the willingness to destroy me financially and personally, that's not something I can just forget. I wouldn't expect you to. But I'm willing to see if we can build something new. Not what we had before, but something different. Something based on who you are now instead of who you were then. What would that look like? I don't know yet. But it would start with complete honesty between us. No more lies, no more manipulation, no more schemes. If you're struggling financially, you tell me. If you're having problems at work, you tell me. If you're tempted to take shortcuts or make bad choices, you tell me. And in return? In return, I'll treat you like a son instead of like a criminal. I'll be there for you when you need help. I'll support your efforts to rebuild your life. And I'll try to forgive you for what you did to me. Try to forgive? Danny, forgiveness isn't a light switch. I can't just decide to forget 3 years of betrayal and pain, but I can decide to stop letting those 3 years define our relationship forever. Danny nodded, and I could see tears in his eyes. Dad, there's something else I need to tell you. What's that? I've been going to counseling. Individual therapy, family counseling, financial counseling. I'm trying to understand how I got so far off track and make sure it never happens again. Good. That's good. And I've been going to church. I'm not sure if I'm religious exactly, but I'm trying to find some kind of moral foundation that's bigger than my own wants and needs. Your mother would be proud of that. I think about her a lot, about how disappointed she would have been in the choices I made, about how much I let down everyone who believed in me. Margaret would have been disappointed, but she also would have been the first one to welcome Danny back and help him rebuild his life. She had a capacity for forgiveness that I'd always admired, but never fully understood. Your mother always said that people could change if they really wanted to. She said the key was wanting to change for the right reasons. What are the right reasons? Not because you got caught, not because you're facing consequences, but because you genuinely believe that the person you were wasn't worthy of the people who loved you. Danny was quiet for a long time, thinking about that. I think that's where I am now, Dad. I think I finally understand that the person I was wasn't worthy of you, or Sarah, or my kids. I want to become someone who is. Then that's where we start. We shook hands across that diner table, just like Jack Hartwell and I had done 3 years earlier. But this handshake felt different, heavier, more tentative. It wasn't sealing a business deal. It was opening the door to the possibility of redemption. Over the next several months, Danny and I began the slow process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't automatic. There were awkward moments, uncomfortable silences, and conversations that dredged up painful memories for both of us. But there were also good moments. I watched him at his job sites working alongside men half his age, learning new techniques, proving that he was willing to start over at the bottom. I watched him with his children, patient and attentive in ways he'd never been before his incarceration. I watched him with Sarah, working to rebuild a marriage that had been severely damaged by his choices. The restitution payments came every month, exactly as promised. $500, then $600 when he got a small raise, then $700 when he took on additional responsibilities. It would still take decades to repay what he'd stolen, but the consistency of the payments showed me that he was serious about his commitments. More importantly, he was rebuilding his relationships with his children. Emma, now 15, was old enough to understand what her father had done and why he'd gone to prison. But she was also old enough to see that he was genuinely trying to change. Jake, 13, was less interested in the past and more focused on having his father back for baseball games and school events. Lily, now 12, had largely moved past the anger and confusion of her father's absence and was just happy to have him home. The family dynamics were different now. Sarah was more independent, more assertive about family decisions. The kids had learned to rely on themselves and each other during Danny's absence. Danny was humbler, more grateful, more aware of how fragile family relationships could be. It wasn't the same family that had gathered around my Thanksgiving table in 2022, but it was a family that was healing. As for my relationship with Danny, it evolved slowly. We started with brief, structured meetings, coffee once a month, dinner with the family every few weeks. Gradually, those meetings became more frequent and more natural. We began talking about things other than the past and the restitution payments, current events, the kids' activities, his work, my retirement. We never talked about the construction business. That part of our shared history was too painful, too loaded with betrayal and resentment. Instead, we found new things to connect over, books we'd both read, movies we'd both enjoyed, memories from before everything went wrong. It took almost a year, but eventually I realized that I was looking forward to our conversations. Danny had become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with, someone whose opinions I respected, someone I was proud to call my son. Not because I'd forgotten what he'd done, but because I could see who he'd become in spite of what he'd done. The final piece of our reconciliation came in November 2026, almost exactly 4 years after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. Sarah had invited me to join them for Thanksgiving at their rental house. It would be the first time we'd all shared a holiday meal since Danny's arrest, and everyone was nervous about how it would go. I arrived early to help with the cooking, something I'd never done in the old days when Margaret was alive and handling all the holiday preparations. But cooking together gave us something to focus on besides the awkwardness of the situation. Emma was making rolls from scratch, following a recipe that had belonged to her grandmother. Jake was helping Danny carve the turkey, learning the technique I'd taught Danny 30 years earlier. Lily was setting the table with the same care and attention she'd always brought to special occasions. When we finally sat down to eat, Danny asked if he could say grace. It was a simple prayer, thanking God for family, for second chances, for the opportunity to be together again despite all the mistakes and pain of the past few years. "I know this isn't the same family that used to gather for holidays," he said as we began passing the food around the table. "We've all been changed by what happened, and some of those changes are permanent. But I'm grateful that we're here together, that we found a way to forgive each other and move forward." He looked directly at me. "Dad, I'm grateful that you didn't give up on me completely. I'm grateful that you found a way to show mercy without excusing what I did wrong." I looked around that table at my family, scarred, changed, smaller than it used to be, but still intact, still connected by something deeper than money or business interests or even shared history. "I'm grateful too," I said. "Grateful that we learned the difference between justice and revenge. Grateful that we found our way back to what really matters." Emma raised her glass of apple cider. "To second chances." We all raised our glasses and repeated her toast. "To second chances." As I sit here now, 3 years later, finishing this story at the same kitchen table where I've eaten 10,000 meals and made 1,000,000 decisions, I think about what I've learned from this whole experience. I learned that family loyalty doesn't mean enabling bad behavior. It means holding the people you love accountable for their choices while still leaving the door open for redemption. I learned that revenge might feel satisfying in the moment, but it's ultimately hollow. What I did to Danny wasn't really revenge. It was self-protection. And what mattered in the end wasn't that he was punished, but that he learned from his mistakes. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending that harm never happened. It means choosing not to let someone else's worst moment define your relationship with them forever. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to understand what you actually had. Danny lost his business, his reputation, his freedom, and nearly lost his family. But in losing those things, he found something more valuable: the humility to change, the motivation to become better, and the appreciation for what really matters in life. As for me, I lost the business I'd built and the son I'd raised. But I gained something too: the knowledge that I was strong enough to protect what I'd worked for, wise enough to distinguish between justice and vengeance, and loving enough to welcome back a prodigal son who'd truly learned from his mistakes. The construction company that was once Carpenter Sons is thriving under Jack Hartwell's ownership. Most of the original employees are still there, still building quality projects, still serving the community. The legacy continues, even if the name has changed. Danny is doing well too. He's been promoted twice at his construction job and is now a project supervisor earning decent money. He and Sarah bought a modest house last year, their first owned home since losing the mansion. The kids are thriving. Emma's a senior in high school planning to study engineering. Jake's developing into a fine young man with his father's work ethic and his grandfather's integrity, and Lily's still the bright, joyful child she's always been. The restitution payments continue every month and probably will for the rest of Danny's working life. But they're no longer about the money. They're about remembering that actions have consequences, that trust once broken takes a lifetime to rebuild, and that some debts can never be fully repaid. We spend holidays together now, share Sunday dinners, attend the kids' school events as a family. It's different than it was before, but it's good. Maybe even better because it's built on truth instead of assumptions, on choice instead of obligation. If you're still listening to this story, if you've stayed with me through all the pain and betrayal and ultimate redemption, then you understand something important about human nature. We're all capable of terrible mistakes, but we're also capable of incredible growth. We can lose our way completely and still find our way back if we're willing to do the hard work of change. And sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also capable of becoming the people who teach us the most about grace, about forgiveness, about what it really means to be family. That Thanksgiving dinner in 2022 was the worst day of my life. But it was also the beginning of the most important lesson I've ever learned. That love isn't about never being disappointed by the people you care about. It's about finding a way to love them anyway, not in spite of their flaws, but because of their capacity to overcome those flaws. My name is Franklin Carpenter. I'm 70 years old, and I want you to remember this story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is a parent dealing with a betrayal that feels unforgivable, or an adult child who's made mistakes that feel unrecoverable, or a family that's been torn apart by greed or pride or misunderstanding. And I want them to know that it's possible to come back from the worst mistakes you can imagine. It's possible to rebuild trust that's been completely shattered. It's possible to love someone again after they've hurt you in ways you never thought you could survive. But it takes time. It takes honesty. It takes the willingness to do better, and the wisdom to know that doing better is a choice you have to make every single day for the rest of your life. That's the real lesson here. Not that revenge is sweet, but that redemption is possible. Not that justice always prevails, but that mercy sometimes opens doors that justice alone cannot. And not that family is everything, but that everything worth having is worth fighting for, worth losing and worth finding again. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family relationships, if it gave you hope that broken things can sometimes be mended, then hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the most important stories aren't the ones about people who never make mistakes. They're the ones about people who find their way back from mistakes that seemed unforgivable. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through this long, painful, ultimately hopeful journey. And remember, it's never too late for a second chance, as long as someone is brave enough to take the first step.